Corfu Island in Greece is known for its blue beaches, catamaran rides, and its picturesque environment for holiday-goers. Even back in 1951, Corfu's main form of industry was tourism. Not quite the Instagram hotspot it is today, but certainly already on its way to being just that. Vanda Pieris wasn't one of those tourists that came for the sights. She'd grown up in Corfu, and to her, the world had always just been sparkly beaches and rolling farmlands. She was the daughter of a farmer, and she spent most of her weekends working on her parents' small holding, where they grew oranges. Vanda turned 16 earlier that week, and as a birthday present, her parents had given her some spending money, a rare treat for a farm girl in those days, and the weekend off to hang out with her friends. They were under the impression that Vanda was going to spend the day at the beach with her girlfriends from school, and that she'd be sleeping over at one of their houses that night. Vanda was at the beach, but she wasn't with her girlfriends like she told her deeply religious Orthodox Christian father. She was sure that he'd have stormed over right then and there if he knew she was with a boy. But George Athanasius wasn't just any boy. He was a handsome senior, and they'd secretly been courting for the past 2 months. And today was the first time they'd be spending time together outside of the schoolyard. Vanda wasn't the only one who thought George was the most good-looking boy in school. All of the girls swooned over him, but George only had eyes for Vanda. She was pretty, smart, and sweet, and George already had plans to marry her one day, but he didn't dare say it so soon in the relationship for fear of scaring her off. George refused to let Vanda spend a dime. He insisted on buying them sodas to take along to a secluded outcrop that he knew was usually free of tourists. But to their dismay, they weren't as alone as they'd hoped. At the alcove, there was a wrinkly pair of German nationals enjoying their retirement and burning their pale skin to leather in the sun, as well as a couple with 3 young children. And on the water was a lone man rowing lazy circles in a small one-man canoe. The two quickly made their way into the pleasant water, swimming away as far as they could for their feet to still touch the ground. At least here, chest deep in the water, they could talk and gossip about their classmates, make plans for the holidays, and dream big dreams where no one else could hear. George had Vanda laughing in no time. The other beachgoers might as well have not been there at all. They only had eyes and ears for each other, for just one blissful moment at least. Vanda was in the middle of telling George how she wanted to study nursing after school, wondering if her parents could afford to send her to medical school. He was nodding along, listening intently, when his eyes caught movement in the water. Instinctively, he grabbed Vanda's arm. Vanda turned sharply around to see what George was looking at, but he let go of her arm, laughing at his overreaction. The coast had plenty of dolphins, and the gray blur he'd seen was probably one of them. He'd seen them plenty of times when he was out on his father's fishing boat. Excited at the prospect of seeing a dolphin up close, Vanda turned fully toward the open ocean, eagerly searching the waterline for a sign of the playful creatures. But it wasn't a dolphin at all. In fact, it was a 25-foot-long great white shark that had been skimming the water for hours. The children had left the water before it could attack, and it was just about to try for the man in the canoe when Vanda and George stepped into the water, reverting its attention to the potential prey that was fully submerged, making them much easier targets. When George spotted the swift movement, the shark was making a wide circle around them, hoping to come at them from behind. George had a bad feeling about the situation. Dolphins weren't shy to show themselves, and they traveled in groups, making them easy to see. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't any dolphin. He told Vanda that it might be a good idea for them to head back to shore until they could be sure that there was nothing in the water. A Coast Guard vessel just so happened to enter the alcove at the same time. Vanda relented, disappointed that the sea mammals weren't making an appearance. She struck out for the beach, straight at the shark that had now come full circle. It was ready to launch itself at the pair when one of them came swimming straight at it. Making the decision of which one to go for was now an easy one. Vanda, her head down in the water in a freestyle stroke, didn't even see the beast rear out of the water, but everyone else in the vicinity did. Like some bizarre scene out of a cartoon, Vanda's head and shoulders disappeared right into the gaping maw of the beast. Without hesitation, it clamped its jaws shut. Vanda only knew darkness and an instant of crushing pain before her life winked out of existence. Her beeline straight into the predator's jaws was a pure stroke of luck, both for the hungry animal and, in a way, even for Vanda. Her death was so sudden that she didn't even have a chance to comprehend what was happening before she died. The bite was so strong and final that it severed her cleanly in half, right below her rib cage. Opening its throat into a suctioning hollow, it inhaled Vanda's upper body whole. George flung himself at Vanda the moment the animal's red mouth opened in front of her. He grabbed her legs, but it was all he was holding. To his horror, he was standing with a pair of human legs, with no upper body, in his hands. The water around them became instantly crimson with blood and the contents of Vanda's entrails that were floating outside of the severed cavity that used to be her abdomen. George had about as little time to comprehend what was happening as Vanda had when a 4,000-pound aquatic cannon slammed into him. The shark was back, but it wasn't here for George. It was here for the rest of Vanda. When the force of the animal knocked him over, George lost his grip on Vanda's remains, going into the water head first. The next moment he was grabbed by the hair. Blinded by the water in his eyes, he swung his fists blindly, fighting off the predator that surely had him in its grasp. But it was Mr. Peroni, the captain of the Coast Guard vessel. When they saw what was happening, the crew raced over to the scene. Peroni grabbed the only moving thing he could see in the waters so dark with red that it was practically impossible to make out what was happening beneath the surface. That moving thing just happened to be George's jet black hair. The captain hauled the teenager straight over the side of the hull, but Vanda was gone. All that remained of the pretty and vivacious girl was a torn piece of intestine that was floating on the gentle red waves. Briefly, they spotted a single fin slicing through the water in the distance before the animal disappeared into the deep forever. George was rushed to the hospital. That single knock from the massive shark had shattered 4 of his ribs, but the stay under professional care was more necessary for the shock that the boy was in. George was so hysterical that they had to sedate him before he drove his own broken ribs into his lungs. For 3 days, Mr. Pierres sat beside George's bedside. He'd heard that the lad tried to save his daughter, and honestly, he'd known that the two were secretly dating, and despite their surety that he'd be angry, he was actually looking forward to inviting the boy over for dinner once they were ready to come out with the truth. When George was finally able to regain his composure, it was Vanda's father who wheeled him in his wheelchair to attend the memorial at the church. There was no official funeral, since there was nothing left of Vanda to bury, but the small community all turned up nonetheless. Everyone knew everyone, after all, and when one of their own was lost, they all mourned together. Vanda Pierres had met her terrifying final affliction.